The rain hammered against the rusted metal roof of the abandoned gas station. Tap, tap, tap. Like a relentless reminder of Jake Thompson's fallen life, he pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric barely holding together after 2 years of street living. The cold October wind whistled through the broken windows. Carrying with it the scent of wet asphalt and broken dreams, Jake stared at his calloused hands. Hands that once held his wife Sarah's face so tenderly, hands that once turned wrenches with purpose and pride. Now they trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of memories that refused to let him sleep. 2 years, he whispered to the empty darkness. 2 years since that drunk driver took everything from me. The mechanic shop had been his life's work. 15 years building a reputation, treating every customer like family. But when Sarah died, when the hospital bills piled up like mountains of despair, when the grief consumed him so completely that he couldn't even hold a wrench steady, everything crumbled. The bank took the shop, then the house, then his dignity. But somehow, Jake had held on to one thing, his humanity. A rusted toolbox sat beside his makeshift bed, a cardboard mat covered with newspapers. Inside that box were the few tools he'd managed to keep, the ones that helped him survive. A kind word here, a quick car repair there, maybe $5 or $10 to buy a sandwich. It wasn't much, but it kept him breathing. The storm outside grew stronger, and Jake noticed headlights cutting through the rain about a quarter-mile down the road. The light seemed to be slowing down, then stopping completely. Car trouble, he muttered. Recognizing the signs, his mechanic instincts, dulled but not dead, stirred within him. He could have stayed put, could have minded his own business. After all, what could a homeless man offer someone driving a car fancy enough to have those bright lead headlights? But Jake Thompson had never been the kind of man to turn his back on someone in need. He grabbed his toolbox and stepped into the storm. The rain felt like ice needles against Jake's face as he approached the stranded vehicle. Through the downpour, he could make out the sleek silhouette of a luxury sedan, something European, expensive, the kind of car he used to dream about working on back when dreams still meant something. The driver's side window rolled down just a crack, and Jake caught a glimpse of a woman's face, worry etched in her features, dark hair slightly disheveled. "Excuse me," Jake called out, raising his voice over the storm. "Do you need help?" The window hesitated, then lowered a bit more. The woman inside looked to be in her early 40s, with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be assessing him carefully. She was clearly nervous, and who could blame her? A stranger approaching in the middle of a storm, especially one who looked like Jake did now. "My car just stopped," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent. Spanish, maybe. "The engine made this weird noise, and then nothing. I called for roadside assistance, but they said it could be hours in this weather." Jake nodded, water streaming down his face. "Mind if I take a look? I'm a mechanic, or at least I used to be." Something in his voice, perhaps the genuine concern or maybe just desperation, recognizing desperation, made the woman nod. She popped the hood release. Jake lifted the hood and immediately smelled it. Coolant mixed with oil. Not good. He pulled out a small flashlight from his toolbox, one of the few things that still worked properly in his life, and peered into the engine bay. "When did you last have your timing belt checked?" he asked. "My what belt?" Jake almost smiled. Here was someone who could afford a $60,000 car but didn't know the first thing about what made it run. Reminded him of the old days, when customers would bring him their pride and joy and trust him completely to make it right. "Your timing belt. It snapped. That's why your engine seized up." He straightened up, wiping rain from his eyes. "The good news is, it's fixable. The bad news is, it's not something I can do here on the side of the road with what I have." The woman's shoulders sagged. "So I'm stuck?" "Not necessarily." Jake closed the hood gently. "There's a 24-hour diner about 2 miles up the road if you want. I can walk with you there. You can stay warm, get some coffee, and call someone to pick you up. Your car will be safe here until morning." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Here was a stranger, clearly down on his luck, offering to walk 2 miles in a storm to help her get to safety. She could have been anyone, could have been dangerous, could have been lying, but something about Jake's eyes. There was kindness there. Broken, weathered kindness, but real nonetheless. Real. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jake Thompson." "I'm Elena." She paused. "Elena Martinez, and yes, I'd appreciate the company." As they began walking into the storm, Elena noticed something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Jake had positioned himself on the side closest to the road, shielding her from the spray of water kicked up by the occasional passing car. He walked slightly ahead, testing the ground for puddles and obstacles, then guiding her around them. This man, who had every reason to be bitter, who clearly had nothing, was protecting her. "Jake," she said as they walked, "what happened to you? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." Jake was quiet for so long that Elena thought he hadn't heard her over the storm. Then, in a voice barely louder than the rain, he began to tell her about Sarah. The Nighthawk diner glowed like a beacon through the storm, its neon sign flickering but determined. Jake pushed open the glass door and held it for Elena, both of them dripping puddles onto the checkered floor. The place was nearly empty, just a tired-looking waitress named Dolores behind the counter, and a truck driver nursing his third cup of coffee in a corner booth. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, mixing comfort with the harsh fluorescent lighting. "2 coffees, please," Elena said to Dolores, then turned to Jake. "And whatever food you'd like." Jake shook his head. "The coffee's enough, thank you." "Jake?" Elena's voice was firm but gentle. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" He looked down at his worn boots, water still dripping from his jacket. Yesterday, I had a sandwich yesterday." Elena's heart clenched. She turned back to Dolores. "2 coffees. And could we get 2 of your biggest breakfasts? Eggs, bacon, pancakes, everything." As they settled into a booth, Jake pulled out a thermos from his toolbox, dented and scratched, but clean. He poured Elena a cup of coffee from it. "This is still warm," he said. "Probably better than what they have here. I made it this morning." Elena stared at the cup. This man, who was clearly hungry, who was living on the streets, was sharing his coffee with her. The generosity was so pure, so unexpected, that she felt tears threatening to form. "Tell me about Sarah," she said softly. Jake's hands wrapped around his own cup, seeking warmth, and slowly, like water through a crack in a dam, the story poured out. Sarah had been a teacher, 3rd grade. She used to say that 8-year-olds were the perfect age, old enough to have real conversations, young enough to still believe in magic. They'd been married 12 years, trying for children, saving up to buy a bigger house. She had this laugh, Jake said, his voice distant, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "I used to do stupid things just to hear it." The drunk driver had hit her car at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Jake remembered the exact time because he'd been looking at the clock in his shop, thinking about what to make for dinner, when the phone rang. The medical bills, they just kept coming. Insurance covered some, but not enough. "I mortgaged the shop, then the house. Sarah was in a coma for 3 months before." He stopped, unable to finish. "After she died, I couldn't function, couldn't work. Customers would bring me their cars and I'd just stare at the engines like I'd never seen one before. Lost everything within 6 months." Elena listened, her heart breaking for this man whose life had been shattered by circumstances beyond his control. In her world, the world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, problems were solved with money and power, but Jake's problem couldn't be fixed with either. His problem was grief, and grief followed its own rules. "What keeps you going?" she asked. Jake looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time. Elena Martinez had kind eyes, the kind that seemed to see past surfaces. Her clothes were expensive but not flashy, and despite the storm and the circumstances, she carried herself with quiet confidence. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. Some days I think about just giving up, but then I'll help someone fix their car. Or I'll see a sunset that Sarah would have loved and I think, maybe there's still some purpose left in me." The food arrived, and Elena watched as Jake ate with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come, but even hungry as he clearly was, he ate slowly, savoring each bite, offering to share despite his obvious need. "What about you?" Jake asked between bites. "What brings you out on a night like this?" Elena hesitated. In her world, introductions began with titles and net worth. She was Elena Martinez, CEO of Martinez Technologies, one of the youngest billionaires in the country. Her face had been on magazine covers. Her company's stock was watched by millions of investors. But looking at Jake, this man who had lost everything but still shared his coffee with a stranger, she didn't want to be that person. Not tonight. "I was driving back from a meeting, a difficult one. Sometimes I just need to drive to think, clear my head." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been coming from a meeting, a board meeting, where they discussed laying off 3,000 employees to increase quarterly profits. Elena had been the only voice opposing the decision, and she'd lost. 3,000 families would lose their income so that shareholders could see a slightly better return. "What kind of work do you do?" Jake asked. I run a company, technology." She stirred her coffee, avoiding his eyes. Sometimes the decisions we have to make, they're not easy. Jake nodded. I imagine they're not. You seem like someone who cares about people. That's probably what makes it hard. His simple assessment hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had seen her as just a person who cared? Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as a public figure, but as someone trying to do right in a complicated world. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two souls finding unexpected solace in each other's company. Outside, the storm began to ease, but neither of them seemed eager to leave this small pocket of warmth and understanding. Jake looked at his watch, a cheap digital thing that somehow still worked. It's getting late. Do you have someone you can call? Elena nodded. My driver, he'll come get me. She paused. What about you? Where will you go? Back to the gas station. I've got a dry spot there. The thought of Jake returning to that cold, empty place while she went back to her penthouse apartment made Elena's chest tighten. But what could she do? Offer him money? He'd probably refuse, and even if he didn't, money wouldn't fix what was really broken in Jake Thompson. As they prepared to leave, Elena did something that surprised them both. She reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand. Thank you, she said, for helping me tonight. For the coffee, for reminding me that there are still good people in the world. Jake squeezed back. Thank you for listening. I haven't talked about Sarah in a long time. They exchanged phone numbers. Though Jake admitted he only had an old prepaid phone that barely worked. Elena's driver arrived 20 minutes later in a sleek black car, and as she got in, she looked back at Jake one last time. He was walking back into the storm, shoulders hunched against the wind, carrying his toolbox like it held all his remaining dreams. Elena didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about Jake's hands, skilled hands, that had once built a life. Now reduced to begging for spare change, she thought about his story, his kindness, his quiet dignity in the face of devastating loss, and she began to form a plan. Jake woke to the sound of engines, multiple engines, idling in perfect synchronization. For a moment he thought he was dreaming in his half-awake state. The sound reminded him of his old shop, the way customers' cars would line up on busy Saturdays, engines humming while they waited for service. But as consciousness fully returned, Jake realized the sounds were real, and they were very close. He sat up on his cardboard bed, his back protesting from another night on the hard ground. Through the broken window of the abandoned gas station, he could see them, 4 identical black SUVs arranged in a precise formation in the parking lot. Jake's heart began to race. What the hell? The vehicles were massive, clearly expensive, with tinted windows that revealed nothing about their occupants. They looked like something from a movie, the kind of cars that carried government officials, or worse, had he done something wrong? Was helping Elena somehow illegal? Maybe she was married and her husband thought. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He'd heard stories about what happened to homeless people who got in the way of the wrong people. Maybe Elena wasn't who she seemed. Maybe he'd stumbled into something dangerous. The passenger door of the lead SUV opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than Jake used to make in a month. The man looked around the abandoned gas station with the careful assessment of someone trained to notice details. Security. Definitely security. Jake grabbed his toolbox and edged toward the back of the building. If he could make it to the woods behind the station, maybe he could disappear before whatever this was got started. But as he moved, the man in the suit turned directly toward his hiding spot. Mr. Thompson. The voice was clear, professional, but not unfriendly. Mr. Jake Thompson. Jake froze. They knew his name. How did they know his name? Sir, there's no need to run. We're here on behalf of Mrs. Martinez. She asked us to find you. Elena. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Whatever this was, it wasn't what he'd feared. Jake stepped out from behind the building, his toolbox clutched in his hands like a security blanket. I'm Jake Thompson, he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. The man in the suit smiled, genuinely smiled, and Jake felt some of his tension ease. Excellent. My name is Marcus Rivera. I work for Ms. Martinez. She asked me to deliver something to you. As Marcus spoke, the doors of all 4 SUVs opened. More people emerged, men and women in professional attire, but also others in work clothes. Jake counted 12 people total, all of them looking at him with expressions that ranged from curious to, was that respectful? Ms. Martinez wanted me to give you this first, Marcus said, approaching with an envelope in his hand. She said to tell you that last night was the most genuine conversation she'd had in years, and that your kindness meant more to her than you could possibly know. Jake took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. Inside he found a letter and a check. The check made his knees weak. It was for $50,000. $50,000. I can't accept this, Jake stammered. I just helped her with her car. Anyone would have done the same thing. Marcus shook his head. Mr. Thompson, with respect, not everyone would have done what you did, Mrs. Martinez told me. How you walked her to safety in the storm, how you shared your coffee, how you listened to her without judgment. She said you treated her like a person, not like what she usually encounters. Jake looked up from the check, confused. What does she usually encounter? Marcus exchanged a glance with one of the other people who had emerged from the SUVs, a woman in a business suit who was watching the interaction with interest. Mr. Thompson, Marcus said carefully, do you know who Elena Martinez is? Jake shrugged. She said she runs a technology company. Seem nice, why? The woman in the business suit stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, I'm Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Martinez's chief operating officer. Elena Martinez is the CEO and founder of Martinez Technologies. She's one of the wealthiest people in the country. The words didn't compute at first. Jake stared at Jennifer, then at Marcus, then at the check in his hands. She's, what? A billionaire, sir. Forbes listed her as the 37th richest person in America last year. Jake sat down heavily on an overturned crate, the envelope and check falling from his numb fingers. The woman he'd helped, the woman who'd sat in a diner and listened to him talk about Sarah, the woman who'd seemed so normal, so genuine. But she was just, we talked about. Jake's voice trailed off as he tried to process this information. Marcus picked up the envelope and gently placed it back in Jake's hands. She was just a person who needed help and you helped her. That's exactly what she told us. She said you didn't ask her what she did for work, didn't ask for anything in return, didn't try to impress her or get something from her. You just helped. Jake looked at the check again. $50,000. It was more money than he'd seen since before Sarah got sick. It was enough to get an apartment, to buy clothes, to maybe start over. There's more, Marcus said gently. More. Jake looked up, certain he'd misheard. Jennifer stepped forward again. Ms. Martinez asked us to offer you a job. Mr. Thompson, head mechanic at our corporate headquarters. We maintain a fleet of vehicles for our executives, and we need someone with your skills and your character. Jake's world tilted. A job. A real job. Not scrounging for repair work on the side of the road. The position comes with a starting salary of $80,000 a year, Jennifer continued. Full benefits including health insurance and MS. Martinez has arranged for temporary housing while you get back on your feet. A furnished apartment, paid for 6 months. Jake couldn't speak. The numbers, the offers, the sheer impossibility of it all crashed over him like a wave. Yesterday he'd been sharing his last coffee with a stranger. Today that stranger was offering him a new life. Why? He finally managed to ask. Marcus smiled. Because, Mr. Thompson, kindness is the rarest commodity in Miss Martinez's world, and you gave it freely, expecting nothing in return. She said, that's the kind of person she wants working with her. Jake looked around at the abandoned gas station that had been his home for 2 years, at the makeshift bed, the rusty tools, the life of desperation he'd been living. Then he looked at the people surrounding him, professional, respectful, offering him a way back to dignity. But even as hope bloomed in his chest, doubt crept in. What if I can't do it? Jake asked. What if I've been out of the game too long? What if I let her down? Marcus crouched down so he was at eye level with Jake. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Martinez doesn't make mistakes about people. She built a multi-billion-dollar company by knowing who to trust. She trusts you. Jake closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years allowed himself to imagine a future. A real future, with purpose and hope and maybe even happiness. When he opened his eyes, everyone was still there. It wasn't a dream. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then, stronger. Yes, I accept. The smile that spread across Marcus's face was radiant. Excellent. Shall we get you cleaned up and show you to your new home? As Jake gathered his few possessions and walked toward the SUVs. He couldn't help but think about Sarah. She'd always believed in the power of kindness, always said that what you put into the world comes back to you. Maybe she was right, Jake thought as he climbed into the luxurious vehicle. Maybe she was right all along. 3 months later, Jake Thompson stood in the gleaming service bay of Martinez Technologies' corporate garage. His hands steady on a wrench for the first time in years. The space was a mechanic's dream. State-of-the-art equipment, pristine tools, perfect lighting, and a team of skilled technicians who'd welcomed him with surprising warmth. He was working on Elena's car, the same luxury sedan that had broken down on that stormy night. The timing belt repair was delicate work, requiring precision and patience. Jake's hands moved with practiced confidence, muscle memory returning like an old friend. "How's she looking, boss?" Jake glanced up to see Tommy Martinez, no relation to Elena despite the name, one of the younger mechanics who'd become something of a protégé. At 23, Tommy had raw talent but lacked experience. Jake had been teaching him, sharing the tricks and techniques learned over 15 years in the trade. "She'll purr like a kitten when we're done," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a clean rag. The simple act of having clean rags, good tools, and meaningful work still amazed him sometimes. The apartment Elena had arranged was small but perfect. One bedroom, clean, safe, with a view of the city that reminded him daily of how far he'd come. Jake had furnished it simply, spending Elena's generous check carefully. Most of it was still in the bank. Earning interest, a safety net he'd never had before. He'd bought only what he needed: basic furniture, clothes that fit, a phone that actually worked, and one splurge, a framed photo of Sarah that he'd retrieved from storage. She smiled at him from the nightstand every morning, and somehow her expression seemed, "Proud, Mr. Thompson?" Jake turned to see Jennifer Walsh approaching, her heels clicking on the polished concrete floor. She'd become something of a friend over the past months, checking on his progress, making sure he had everything he needed. "The quarterly board meeting is next week," she said. "Eleanor asked if you'd be willing to say a few words about the garage operations. Nothing formal, just your perspective on the team, the equipment, how things are running." Jake felt the familiar flutter of nerves. Speaking to executives still intimidated him, despite Elena's constant reassurance that his voice mattered. "I don't know, Jennifer. I'm much better with engines than with people in suits," she smiled. "Eleanor specifically said to tell you that the people in suits need to hear from someone who understands what real work looks like. She values your opinion, Jake. We all do." Before Jake could respond, the service bay's main door opened and Elena herself walked in. Even after 3 months, seeing her still gave Jake a small shock. This was the same woman who'd sat across from him in that diner, but here in her element, she radiated power and confidence. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her hair pulled back professionally, talking rapidly into a wireless earpiece. The call sounded tense. Something about quarterly projections and investor concerns. "I understand the market pressures, David, but we're not laying off 3,000 people to boost short-term numbers," she said firmly. "Find another way." "No, that's final, because it's the right thing to do." "That's why," she ended the call with obvious frustration, then noticed Jake watching. "Sorry," she said, her expression softening. "Board members seem to think profit margins are more important than people's livelihoods." Jake nodded. He'd learned something about Elena's management philosophy over the past months. She ran a company worth billions, but she never forgot that behind every number was a human being with bills to pay and dreams to pursue. "How's the car?" she asked, approaching the lift where her sedan was raised. "Good as new. Better, actually. I've made a few improvements to the cooling system. Should prevent the problem from happening again." Elena smiled, the genuine smile Jake remembered from that night in the diner. "You know, I've been thinking about that night a lot lately. Oh, when my car broke down, I was coming from a board meeting where I'd fought to prevent those layoffs I was just discussing on the phone. I lost that fight, Jake. 3,000 families lost their income because I couldn't convince a room full of suits that doing the right thing was worth more than quarterly profits." She leaned against a workbench, her corporate armor seeming to fade. "I was driving in the rain, furious and heartbroken, questioning everything I'd built. And then my car died, and suddenly there was this man who helped me without asking for anything, who shared his coffee, who listened to me complain about work without even knowing who I was." Jake set down his wrench. "You never complained, you just said decisions were hard. Because you made me feel like a person again. Not just a CEO. Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Elena's phone buzzed with another call, but she ignored it. "That's why I wanted to help you, Jake. Not as charity, not as some tax write-off, but because kindness like yours deserves to be rewarded. Because people like you remind the rest of us why we're supposed to be working so hard in the first place." The phone buzzed again, insistently. Elena glanced at it and sighed. "I have to take this, but Jake, think about speaking at the board meeting. These people need to hear from someone who understands that business is about more than just numbers." As she walked away to take her call, Jake looked around the garage at his team, at the work they did, At the life he'd rebuilt from nothing 3 months ago, he'd been sleeping on cardboard in an abandoned gas station. Today, he was head mechanic at one of the country's most successful companies, with people who respected his opinions and valued his contributions, but more than the job, more than the apartment, more than the financial security, Elena had given him something even more precious. She'd given him back his sense of purpose. Tommy approached with a diagnostic tablet. "Boss, I'm getting some weird readings on the executive transport van. Think you could take a look?" Jake smiled and took the tablet. "Let's see what we're dealing with." As he walked toward the van, Jake caught sight of his reflection in one of the polished chrome bumpers. The man looking back at him stood straighter, looked healthier, seemed more confident. It was still Jake Thompson, but it was a Jake Thompson who had hope again. "Thank you, Sarah," he thought. "Thank you for teaching me that kindness matters, and thank you, Elena, for reminding me that I still have something to offer the world." The diagnostic readings showed a simple fix, a loose connection in the electrical system, nothing major, nothing complicated, just the kind of problem that looked scary on a computer screen, but took 5 minutes to solve with the right knowledge and tools. Kind of like life, Jake reflected. Sometimes the biggest problems had the simplest solutions. Sometimes all it took was someone willing to help, and someone willing to accept that help. He got to work, his hands steady and sure, surrounded by the sounds of productive work and the quiet satisfaction of problems being solved. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but Jake wasn't worried. He had a place to go now. People who counted on him, work that mattered. The rain could come. Rain. He was ready for it. 1 year later, Jake Thompson stood before the board of directors of Martinez Technologies, but this time he wasn't nervous. He'd been here before, spoken to these people before, earned their respect through months of reliable work and honest insight. Today was different. Though today, Elena had asked him to present something special. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice steady and clear. "A year ago, I was homeless. I was sleeping in an abandoned gas station, fixing cars for spare change, convinced that my life was over." The boardroom was silent. Attentive, these were powerful people. Investors, executives, industry leaders. But Jake had learned they were also human beings, capable of understanding what truly mattered. "Elena Martinez found me on the worst night of my life and saw something worth saving, not because I was special, but because she understood that everyone deserves a second chance." Jake clicked to the next slide of his presentation. The screen showed the corporate garage bustling with activity, his team of mechanics working with precision and pride. "This is our team today, 12 full-time mechanics, 3 apprentices, and the most efficient corporate fleet maintenance operation in the industry. But that's not the real story." He clicked again. The screen now showed photos, candid shots of his team at work, laughing, teaching each other, solving problems together. The real story is Tommy Martinez, who was working part-time in a quick lube shop and is now our lead diagnostic technician. It's Maria Santos, who was laid off from the aerospace industry and is now training other women in automotive repair. It's David Chen, who was told he was too old to learn new technology and is now our hybrid systems specialist. Another click, a graph showing productivity, efficiency and cost savings, but also employee satisfaction scores, retention rates, and training program success metrics. Every person in our garage has a story. Every person was given an opportunity to be more than their circumstances suggested they could be. Elena didn't just save one homeless mechanic, she created a philosophy that lifts everyone up. Jake paused, looking around the room. A year ago, he would have been intimidated by these faces. Now he saw them as colleagues, as partners in something larger than profit margins, which brings me to why I'm really here today. He clicked to the final slide. It was a proposal. Detailed, professional, ambitious, the Martinez Foundation Second Chances Program, a nationwide initiative to identify talented individuals whose circumstances have prevented them from reaching their potential. Homeless veterans with technical skills, single mothers with business ideas, young people aging out of foster care with dreams but no connections. The room stirred with interest. Eleanor, sitting at the head of the table, was smiling with quiet pride. "We partner with local businesses to provide jobs, training and support. We offer microloans for small business development. We create apprenticeship programs in high-demand fields, and we do it all with the same principle that saved my life. We see people for who they could become, not just who they are today." Jake closed his laptop and looked directly at the board members. "The initial investment requirement is $50 million. The projected return on investment, based on job creation, tax revenue, and reduced social services costs, is substantial, but the real return can't be measured in dollars. It's measured in lives changed, families stabilized, communities strengthened. He paused for effect, remembering Elena's coaching on presentations. 1 year ago, I was a statistic, a homeless veteran, a failed business owner, a man who had lost everything. Today, I'm standing before you as head of operations for what will become the largest private workforce development program in the country. That transformation didn't happen because I was special. It happened because someone was willing to invest in human potential. Jake looked around the room one more time. The question before you today is simple. How many more stories like mine are we willing to create? The silence that followed felt different from the usual board meeting quiet. It was thoughtful, contemplative, charged with possibility. Margaret Whitfield, the board's most senior member and traditionally its most conservative voice, was the first to speak. Mr. Thompson, what makes you think this program can scale? Individual success stories are inspiring, but creating systematic change is much more complex. Jake had anticipated this question. Because we're not trying to change the system, Mrs. Whitfield. We're trying to change how we see people within the system. Every successful business already knows that the right person in the right position can transform an entire operation. We're just expanding the definition of right person to include people who haven't had the right opportunities. Elena leaned forward. The pilot program Jake described has been running quietly for 6 months. We've placed 47 individuals in positions throughout our supply chain partners. The retention rate is 96%. The productivity metrics exceed our standard hires by 12%, and the cost per placement is 60% lower than traditional recruiting. David Morrison. The CFO studied his tablet. The numbers are impressive, but what about liability issues, background checks, the due diligence required for this scale of operation? Already addressed, Jake replied. We partner with existing non-profits for initial screening and support. We have relationships with legal aid societies for background verification. And we maintain a support network for program participants to prevent relapse into crisis situations. The questions continued for another hour, but Jake could sense the mood shifting. These were business people, and the business case was solid. But more than that, these were people who had worked with Elena long enough to understand her values and to see how those values translated into sustainable success. Finally, Elena called for a vote. All in favor of approving the Martinez Foundation's Second Chances program as proposed. One by one, hands rose around the table, not unanimously. This was a corporate board after all, but by a clear majority. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out, Elena approached Jake. Well done, she said simply. Thank you for everything, not just today, but everything. Elena smiled. Jake, do you remember what you told me that night in the diner about not knowing what kept you going? Jake nodded. I think you've found your answer. As they walked out of the boardroom together, Jake caught sight of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there were people like he had been. Talented, desperate, invisible to a world that measured worth in bank accounts and job titles, but not for much longer. 3 months later, Jake stood in the rain again, but this time, he wasn't seeking shelter. He was offering it. The Martinez Foundation's first permanent facility was a converted warehouse in the industrial district, transformed into a training center, temporary housing, and support hub. Jake watched as Maria Santos, his former mechanic, now the program's automotive training director, taught a class of 12 students how to diagnose engine problems. Among the students was Robert Hayes, a former army mechanic who'd been living in his car for 8 months. There was Lisa Chen, a single mother who'd lost her administrative job when the company downsized, and there was Miguel Rodriguez, just 18, aging out of foster care with nothing but determination and a worn toolbox his social worker had helped him buy. Mr. Thompson. Jake turned to see a young woman approaching, her clothes worn but clean, her eyes nervous but hopeful. She clutched a folder of papers against her chest like armor. I'm Jennifer Kim. I heard about the program from the counselor at the women's shelter. I used to work in computer repair before. Before everything fell apart, I was wondering if we might have a place for you. Jake finished gently. Jennifer nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake smiled, the same kind of smile Elena had given him that night in the diner when she'd accepted his help without judgment. Let's go talk to Maria. She's always looking for people who understand electronics. The automotive industry is changing fast, and we need instructors who can bridge the gap between traditional mechanics and modern computer systems. As they walked toward the training bay, Jennifer's shoulders straightened slightly. It was a small change, but Jake recognized it. It was the first stirring of hope after a long season of despair. "Mr. Thompson," Jennifer said as they reached the classroom door, "why are you doing this? I mean, why do you care about people like me?" Jake paused, his hand on the door handle. Through the glass, he could see Maria's students bent over engine blocks. Learning, growing, becoming more than their circumstances had allowed them to be. "Because someone cared about me when I had nothing to offer in return," he said simply. "And because I learned that the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or a job. It's the chance to remember who they really are underneath all the things that have gone wrong." He opened the door, and they stepped into the warm, purposeful noise of people building better futures with their own hands. Later that afternoon, Jake received a call that made his heart skip. It was Marcus Rivera, Elena's security chief, with news that would change everything once again. "Jake, you need to get to the hospital. Elena's been in an accident." The world tilted. Jake's hands trembled as he grabbed his keys, the same way they had trembled 2 years ago when he'd gotten the call about Sarah. "Not again, please, not again." The drive to the hospital was a blur of honking horns and red lights. Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Elena had become more than his employer, more than his benefactor. She had become family, the sister he'd never had, the friend who'd saved his soul. At the hospital, Jake found Marcus in the waiting room, his usually composed demeanor cracked with worry. "How is she?" Jake asked breathlessly. "Stable, conscious. A drunk driver ran a red light." Marcus's voice trailed off, the irony not lost on either of them. Jake closed his eyes, the familiar pain of loss threatening to overwhelm him, but this time was different. This time, Elena was alive. When he finally saw her, Elena was propped up in bed, her left arm in a cast, her face bruised but alert. She smiled when she saw him, that same genuine smile that had changed his life. "Jake, I was hoping you'd come. Are you kidding? Try and keep me away." Jake pulled a chair close to her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "Which technically I did." Elena's attempt at humor couldn't hide the shakiness in her voice. "Jake, I need to tell you something. When that car was coming toward me, when I thought this might be it, the only thing I could think about was how glad I was that we started the foundation. How many lives we've already changed." Jake felt tears threatening. "Elena, no, let me finish. You gave me back my purpose, Jake. Before I met you, I was just accumulating money, fighting board members, forgetting why I started the company in the first place. You reminded me that business is supposed to serve people, not the other way around." Elena reached for his hand with her uninjured arm. "I want you to take over as executive director of the foundation. Full autonomy, unlimited budget, complete creative control. It's time for the student to become the teacher." Jake stared at her, speechless. Executive director meant he would be running a $50 million operation, managing hundreds of employees, overseeing programs in dozens of cities. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility," he admitted. Elena squeezed his hand. "Jake, 2 years ago, you helped a stranger on the side of the road without asking for anything in return. Today, you're running the most successful workforce development program in the country. You're ready, you've been ready." 6 months later, Jake stood before a crowd of 2,000 people at the Foundation's first annual gala. The ballroom was filled with success stories, former program participants who now owned their own businesses, taught in universities, worked as engineers and technicians and nurses and teachers. At the head table sat Elena, fully recovered and beaming with pride. Beside her was Jennifer Kim, now the Foundation's Director of Technology Training. Next to Jennifer was Robert Hayes, who had just opened his third auto repair shop, and at the far end was Miguel Rodriguez, who had recently been accepted to engineering school on a full scholarship. 2 years ago, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I thought my story was over. I thought the best chapters of my life were behind me, buried with my wife in a cemetery I couldn't even afford to visit." The room was absolutely silent. "But I learned something that night in the rain, something that every person in this room embodies. Our stories don't end when we fall down. They begin when someone helps us stand back up." Jake looked out at the audience. Donors, program participants, board members, community leaders, all united by a shared belief in second chances. The Martinez Foundation has placed over 3,000 people in stable employment this year. We've helped launch 400 small businesses. We've provided housing assistance to over 1,500 families. But those are just numbers. He gestured to the success stories seated throughout the room. The real measure of our work is sitting right here. It's Robert, who went from living in his car to employing 12 people. It's Jennifer, who went from a women's shelter to training the next generation of tech workers. It's Miguel, who aged out of foster care and will graduate as an engineer. Jake paused, his eyes finding Elena's. And it's all of us, learning that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or technology or political influence. It's one human being seeing another human being's potential and deciding to invest in it. The applause was thunderous. But Jake wasn't finished. Tonight I'm announcing the Foundation's next phase, the National Second Chances Initiative. Over the next 5 years, we will expand to all 50 states, partnering with local businesses and community organizations to create opportunities for anyone who needs a fresh start. The crowd erupted again, but Jake raised his hand for quiet. But I want to end with a personal note. Elena Martinez saved my life, but not in the way you might think. She didn't save me with money or a job or even kindness. Though she gave me all of those things, she saved me by seeing me, really seeing me, when I had forgotten how to see myself. Jake's voice grew softer, more intimate. 2 years ago, I was invisible. Today, I stand before you as proof that no one is beyond redemption. No one is without value, and no story is ever truly over as long as there are people willing to help write the next chapter. As the evening wound down, Jake found himself on the hotel's rooftop terrace looking out over the city lights. Elena joined him, moving slowly but steadily. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Overwhelming, terrifying, perfect." Jake smiled. "Like everything worth doing, I suppose." They stood in comfortable silence. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed when they needed it most. "Jake," Elena said finally, "do you think Sarah would be proud?" Jake looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city's glow. "I think she'd be amazed. She always said I had more to give than I realized. Turns out she was right. She sounds like she was a wise woman. The wisest. She would have loved you." "Elena, she would have loved this." "All of it," Elena smiled. "I would have loved her too." As they prepared to leave, Elena handed Jake a small wrapped package. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a simple leather keychain with the Foundation's logo and an inscription, Jake Thompson, proof that kindness changes everything. Jake looked up, confused. "What's this for?" Elena grinned and pointed to the parking garage. In the space marked Executive Director sat a brand new pickup truck, practical, sturdy, built for work. "Every good mechanic needs the right tools," Elena said, "and every leader needs reliable transportation." Jake laughed, the first truly carefree laugh he'd had since Sarah died. "You know I would have been perfectly happy with my old car. I know that's exactly why you deserve the truck." As they walked toward the garage, Jake felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling he'd had that night in the rain when he'd decided to help a stranger. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The truck started with a quiet purr, and Jake rolled down the windows to let in the night air. Somewhere in the city, there were people sleeping rough, people who had lost their jobs, people who thought their stories were over. But Jake Thompson knew better now. He knew that every ending was just a new beginning, waiting for the right person to come along and say, "Let me help." As he drove home through the quiet streets, Jake passed the old abandoned gas station where his new life had begun. It was boarded up now, scheduled for demolition to make way for a new community center, one that would house the Foundation's newest training facility. Jake smiled and kept driving, the radio playing softly, the city lights reflecting off his windshield like stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new stories to begin. But tonight, Jake Thompson, former homeless mechanic, current executive director, eternal believer in second chances, was simply a man driving home to his comfortable apartment, his meaningful work, his purposeful life, and his wife's photograph on the nightstand smiling at him with infinite love and infinite pride. The rain had stopped hours ago, but Jake could still hear its echo in his memory, not as a sound of despair anymore, but as the rhythm of hope falling steadily and surely.